great to see everybody who's with us. We're very thankful you could be here. As you look around, you see that there are a few missing, but we also have a whole bunch more from the Yuba City congregation, and they're all related to Alex, so be nice to them in spite of that, because they're pretty good people. Revenge sells, from Kill Bill to True Grit to Star Wars to The Count of Monte Cristo. Revenge sells. The stories of people who are driven by revenge touches something deep within us. It sells movies, it sells books, it inspires us to do bad things sometimes. Around 120 AD, the Roman satirist named Juvenal, and there's a reason that his name is Juvenal, he wrote these words. And keep in mind, he wrote these. I did not say them. Well, I am going to say them because I thought they were funny. But he says, "Indeed, it is always a paltry, feeble, tiny mind that takes pleasure in vengeance or in revenge." Sounds good, right? Until you read the rest of what he says. "You can deduce it without further evidence than this, that no one delights more in vengeance than a woman." Now, just to illustrate my point, ladies, how do you feel about this? You want to kill him, don't you? And that just illustrates what he said is true. But here's the good news. He's been dead for more than 2,000 years. So there's not much we have to worry about there. But the truth is, the reality is, that it is not just women who are interested in revenge. All of us are. It's something that we find sweet. It's something that we find satisfying to know that the other person got what was coming to them. Now, most of the time we don't admit that out loud, do we? But when something happens to someone, we say, inside we go, we love to get even, or at least we love to see others get what we think they deserve. Our reading this morning is a little bit longer than normal. It's found in Matthew chapter 5, verses 39 through 48. "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Verse 42. "Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, and do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so?" Verse 48. "Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect." As sweet as revenge may feel, Scripture lets us know that it is still wrong. As John Milton once wrote in Paradise Lost, he said, "Revenge at first, though sweet, bitter ere long back on itself recoils." You know, our passage today is actually more confusing than it seems. And it's a passage that has been taken out of context and misunderstood in a lot of different ways. And hopefully we'll talk about some of those ways today. This passage is also the source of 4 very well-known sayings that almost everyone has said or used, and I think most of us understand. The first is an eye for an eye. The second, turn the other cheek. The third, go the 2nd mile. And finally, give the shirt off your back. An eye for an eye. Now, this does not literally mean when they gouge somebody's eye out, but it was meant to restrain revenge, to make sure that the punishment did not exceed the crime, to make sure that there was room for grace and alternative forms of punishment. This kept people from going too far, because when we are hurt, our tendency is to retaliate. Our tendency is to pay back. And often more than just pay back, to pay back and take it one step further. Reminds me of, even though you all know, probably most of you know my politics, so I'm not the biggest fan of The West Wing for political reasons. The West Wing was an amazing show. It was very well written, and it just reminds me of when the president in that show I know I'm taking a side trip here, but it reminds me of when he was in that show. He had a friend that was killed. They had shot down an airplane that his friend was on. And he goes in and he is yelling and screaming, saying, "Wipe them off the face of the earth." And all of the generals are trying to scale him back and saying, we have to make sure that the force is appropriate. That he's like, that's the way that he acted is how most of us want to act, isn't it? You remember 9/11? When we found out who committed those acts, what did most of us think? Now, maybe we didn't say it because we were afraid of what people would say, but what did we think? We thought, let's just drop a few nuclear weapons on the Middle East and it's all taken care of, right? That's what most of us thought. Our tendency is payback. We want others to hurt like we hurt. And it's not enough to get even. We want to add more. It's like playing poker. When we say, I'll raise your insult, a poke in the eye. This policy was written in the Old Testament. And the reason for it was to prevent personal vendettas from inflicting a harsher punishment than the criminal deserved. Imagine for a second that someone blinded one of your family members, that they poked an eye out. What would you want? They shouldn't be killed for it. And that's what the Old Testament law said. The Old Testament law said that if they caused an injury to an eye, that they shouldn't be killed for it. Many times these debts were paid with cash settlements. And we look at that today and we think, what? But isn't that exactly what our insurance system is based on? That's what our legal system is based on. As a matter of fact, it reminded me, and I had to look it up right before church, but we used to have a Boy Scout group as part of our kind of outreach. And I remember we got this insurance program from the Boy Scouts. And we started laughing because it actually went in and broke down how much your body parts were worth. And I looked it up just for fun here. If you lose both hands or both feet, the insurance will pay you $20,000. If you lose your life, they'll pay you $10,000. I think that's interesting. Your life is worth less than your hands and feet are. If you lose your speech or hearing, it's also worth $10,000. If you only lose one hand or one foot, it's worth $5,000. If you use your thumb or your index finger on the same hand, or your hearing in one ear, it's worth $2,500. Now we look at that and go, what? But this all started in the Old Testament. When God said, if somebody blinds somebody, you cannot kill them. And so they started working out cash settlements. But even if we work within the bounds that we're talking about this morning, and that is inflicting reciprocal pain, I think we're still missing the point. Because it's just masking the problem of our heart. Because we still want vengeance. We still want revenge. That's why Jesus says in verse 39, "But I tell you, do not resist an evil person." Now the idea here in this verse is not as much about not resisting as it is about not facing off with them. As it is about, this is not about pacifism. This is not about a refusal to meet evil with violence or war. And I know this might be controversial for some, but I think that there's plenty of room in Scripture for self-defense. But there's not room for vengeance. This is clearly not aggressive. What this verse is reminding us of is to not take personal retribution. Don't escalate by trying to get even. Rather, as Christians, our goal is to de-escalate. Our goal is to diffuse the situation. But that's hard when not everyone agrees with us. In 1971, Nikita Khrushchev said this: "We had no use for the policy of the Gospels. If someone slaps you, just turn the other cheek. We had shown that anyone who slapped us on our cheek would get his head kicked off." Jesus calls us as Christians to respond counterintuitively. Instead of meeting evil with greater or equal force, he urges us to meet it with an amazingly different force, to meet evil with good. There's a parallel passage in Romans chapter 12 that explains this. It says, "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone." Don't do evil because someone did evil to you. Now, doesn't that sound like what you tell your kids? It's easy to tell your kids that, right? Just because he hit you doesn't mean you have to hit him. It's harder to put into practice, though, isn't it? That's exactly, though, what God is saying to us. He's reminding us to not get caught in the business of trying to get even, to make sure that everyone gets what they deserve, because that is not our job. That is his job. Instead, he tells us this: do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. The verse before this, though, kind of sets the stage. The verse before this says, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. It may not always be possible, but we should do whatever we can on our part to make sure that it is. If we do that, if we don't give them what they deserve, where does that leave us? Because I think all of us want justice, don't we? But there's a difference between justice and vengeance. There's a difference between justice and revenge. God has an answer for us in Romans chapter 13 and verse 14. He reminds us that that is what the government is for. He says, government is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant to bring wrath. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. God will take care of justice. And one of the ways that he takes care of justice is by instituting the governments that we have today. Now, it may not be perfect. As a matter of fact, many times it feels like it's not just. A lot of times we feel like people do not get what is coming to them. But the government is the legitimate biblical function of punishment. It's part of how God administers justice. And while we're waiting for the kingdom to come, while we're waiting for that perfect justice to come, we can take comfort today in knowing that God has set a path. Paul goes on in Romans chapter 12 to say, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in doing so you will reap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. We are to answer evil with good. It's difficult, isn't it? Most of us, we respond tit for tat. That's the way the world thinks. If we go back to our passage in Matthew chapter 5 and go back to verse 39, Jesus gives 4 examples of answering evil with good that I think will help us. And these are difficult. The first one is found in verse 39. If people slap you on your right cheek, you must turn the left cheek to them as well. Now, most of these verses, I think, we have taken out of context. Anybody want to volunteer to be the person that lets me slap them? Charles actually does. That's funny. In Jesus' day, getting slapped on the right side of your cheek with the backhand was an insult. Because keep in mind, if you walk up to somebody, I'm not actually going to hit you, Kirk, but if you walk up to somebody and you really want to hurt them, you're going to come this way, right? If you want to insult them, you just slap them across the back of the face. That was an insult in Jesus' time. And as a matter of fact, if you're in the Middle East today, that is still one of the worst insults that you can give someone. Is to slap them, I guess it would be that side, huh? Slap them across the cheek. Now, the problem is here, sometimes we take this verse out of context. This verse does not mean that we don't defend ourselves. This verse does not mean that we say, okay, now that you've done that, please hit me on the other side. That's not, that at first glance, it seems like that's what this verse is saying, right? That's really not what it's saying. Both Paul and Jesus were literally struck on their cheeks. They literally were. Both of them appealed to their rights, but they didn't hit back. And that's the force of this verse. If we are struck, if we are insulted, don't retaliate. Don't get even. Let it go. One author says it would be better to receive a second blow on the other cheek than to stoop to the same level as the person who attacked you. In other words, be kind and generous even when someone verbally assaults you or physically assaults you. The good news is we don't have to wait for violence to put this principle into practice. I'm sure we've met someone at church or on the school grounds or on our job or at our job that were very nice to us. Turning the other cheek means that we show them generosity, that we show them kindness, that we're friendly to them even though they were not friendly to them. And it's not because we have some masochistic desire to be snubbed again. It's just showing our face as if there has been no insult. It's telling them that I forgive, even though you haven't asked for it. It's leaving the issue of justice and fairness to God. And that's really what it all comes down to, is understanding that it's not our job, it's His. The next is found in verse 40. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak also. The tunic was a shirt. It was a garment that was worn close to the body. It's probably the modern equivalent would be a t-shirt that we might wear under something. On top of that, they would have worn a cloak. So they would have worn their tunic first, and then they would have worn a cloak, which is almost like a blanket that they wrapped around. I don't know why my head went here, but many of you at the other building remember the guy that we call shower curtain, who wore a shower curtain to church twice. That was kind of like a cloak in Jesus' day. You know, today if we want to get even with someone, we use the expression to sue their pants off, right? In Jesus' day, they didn't wear pants. So the Jewish law permitted them to sue someone for their shirt. So that was the equivalent in Jesus' time. But the cloak itself, the cloak was that outer garment. It was actually protected by law. It could not be taken away. That's what sheltered them from all of the elements. It could not be taken away. But their shirt could be. The lawsuit in this verse may have very well been a legitimate case. But I think there's an overtone in this passage that suggests that it might have been something that was very unfair. Once again, the idea is not that a Christian is some wimp that just lets everything happen to them. It's that if we get unfairly sued, we don't go after them with vengeance. The idea is that we don't try to get even. That we don't countersue just to make their life miserable. Now that doesn't mean that we don't seek justice. That doesn't mean if somebody treats us unfairly, that we just let it go. But it means that we do not try to get revenge on the situation. If we're in the wrong, we make a settlement. If we're not in the wrong, we put up a defense. That's why Paul says this in 1 Corinthians. The very fact that you have lawsuits among you means that you have been completely defeated already. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be cheated? Most of us understand what's right. But our human nature, our human desire wants to just take it to the next level. It is so hard. And I think that's part of the reason that God has laid in place for us a place of accountability. In most of our homes, we have husbands and wives, we have kids. We have sounding boards, don't we? Now, Christy never has to restrain me, ever. That was sarcastic. But you know, sometimes she has a tendency to get a little angry at people. And I have to grab her and say, no! And that is why we're here. Part of the reason we're here as a group is to remind ourselves, to give ourselves a sounding board. So when we say, you know, this situation at work, I really just want to go off on somebody. You have 40 people here. who can help you with that situation. There's a reason that God has given us each other. The third example is found in verse 41. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Now keep in mind, in Jesus' time in the Roman Empire, a government official could force someone to carry their luggage for up to 1 mile. Roman law said that a person could only be forced to do this service for 1 mile and then was free to go. So by law, if a soldier came up to you and said, I need you to carry this stuff, you had to say, you got it. But can you imagine? I'm sure nobody liked to be forced to do that, did they? Do you think anybody went, oh yay, it's my turn today? No, they hated it. And so I'm sure they would have done exactly what we would do. Now I'm sure that I wouldn't do this. But you know, if a soldier came up and forced us to carry something, I think most of us would say, fine. Legally, I have to carry this. But I want you to know that, you know, my hands are kind of tired. And it might slip in the mud a few times. I mean, there's just nothing I can do about it. Are you really sure you want me to carry it? It might get dirty or broken. Jesus said, don't resent it. Don't try to get even. Be generous. Try to repay evil with good. Go the other mile. Give someone more than they have the right to demand. That had to have been a huge change in thinking for them. Because remember, these were Roman soldiers. These were an occupying force. And Jesus is saying, give them more than what they asked for. In other words, be kind and generous, even when someone forces us to do something against our will. A lot of times we're not outwardly resentful, but we do little things to sabotage it, don't we? If there's something that we have to do, be careful that we don't find subtle ways of venting our resentment, finding subtle ways of venting our anger and getting revenge. Jesus says do it gladly, and on top of that, be generous about it. Finally, the final example is in verse 42. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. This is another one of those verses that causes a lot of soul searching. This is another one of those verses that I think is often taken out of context. Because at face value, it seems like we should give whatever someone asks, right? Ben's been looking for a Bronco. Ben, when you buy the Bronco, I would like to have it, please. Now, does that mean that when he buys a Bronco, he has to give it to me? That's what the verse says, right? So, yes, that's exactly what it means, Ben. In fact, I'll make it even more unappealing. I think because of the context of what we've been talking about here. Probably the people who are asking these things were already taking advantage of the generosity that was being offered. What they deserve is nothing. But Jesus tells us to continue to be generous. And here's where I think the misunderstanding comes. This verse is not telling us that we have to give to everyone whatever they ask. But this is a continuation, an explanation of what is being said all through before we get to this verse. He's saying, don't be vengeful. What they deserve is nothing. But continue to be generous. Don't punish them just because you're angry by cutting them off. Be kind and be generous, even if they mistreat you or manipulate or lie to you. In other words, be kind and generous when someone takes advantage of your generosity. Does that mean that we have to give to everyone? A lot of times that's actually the wrong solution. Almost every week we have someone who's never been to church before here. And yet they come in asking for, most of the time, money for whatever is going on. This week I got 2 of those phone calls. And they always sound really good on the phone. Jesus is not telling us that we have to always give to someone who asks. He's reminding us that if we turn someone down, it should not be to get vengeance on them. It should not be because they're treating us unfairly. There are many requests we cannot fulfill, and there are many requests that we should not fulfill. We should ask questions, and we have to use discernment as we handle his money. But there's no reason in that process that we can't be kind, that we can't be generous, even when someone takes advantage of it. Jesus reminds us in this set of passages that justice is important to us. That it hurts when we have been wronged. But we have to be careful, because the danger is to let our thirst for justice take us to the next step and cause us to have revenge. Don't get even. Even if we've been attacked and cheated and forced and taken advantage of, the answer to overcoming that is generosity and kindness. And leave everything else to God. I want to leave us with a quote this morning from Chip Ingram. He says this: "Life during the brief segment of human history may not always be fair. But when life inside and outside the segment are taken into account together, God's justice will be perfect. In the big picture, He makes all things right. Between this life and the life to come, you and I can know that no person who has ever lived will get a raw deal, even if it looks that way right now." This is one of those things I would like to tell you that the older you get, it seems to make more sense. I know I'm not as old as my parents yet, but I don't think it does. This is one of those set of verses that I think we just have to take on faith and say that in the end, we know that people will get what is coming to them, good and bad. And I think it's important to remember that, good and bad. Because most of the time when we think about this, we think about the people who have punished us, they're going to get what they deserve, right? But the opposite of that is those people who have been doing the right thing, who maybe haven't been rewarded here on this earth, they're going to get what's coming to them too in the end. They're going to have God's grace, His mercy. And it's important that we remember that side of the equation too. So really what it comes down to, I know this is difficult, but it comes down to, let's trust Him. Let's trust what He says. We never want to close without offering an invitation. If there's someone here this morning who's never given your life over to Christ, we invite you to do that. Come believing, repenting of your sins, confessing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. If you've taken those steps, and then after those steps, we're baptized into the watery grave of baptism. But you know, baptism is just the beginning. A lot of times we want to make it the end point. We're Christians now. It's all over. It's just the beginning. Now we live a life of dedication to God. If there's someone here today who's not taken those steps who would like to, we invite you to. Or if you have, but you need the prayers of your brothers and sisters, please come forward as we stand and sing number 902. Number 902.